When I was a high school teacher, I think my attitude towards most educational research is best summed up by the story of a man who's walking his dog in a field and a balloon comes into view, and the man in the basket leans over and says, "Where am I?" And the guy on the ground says, "You're in a balloon 30 feet above my head." And the guy in the basket says, "You must be an educational researcher." How do you get that? "Well, everything you've told me is factually accurate, but of no use to me whatsoever." And the guy on the ground says, "You must be an educational policymaker." How do you get that? "Well, you don't know where you are, you don't know where you're going, and somehow, because I can't help you, it's my fault." What I want to talk about today is some educational research that I think does make a difference in real classrooms. And I think it's a really important time to be doing this kind of work because there are a lot of bandwagons going around. One is school improvement. Now, I've heard that some of you are actually interested in school improvement. Is that right? Yeah. Well, whenever I meet a school improvement guru, I have this overwhelming urge to say, of course, school improvement. There's me been trying to make schools worse for the last 30 years, and you point out I should have been trying to make them better. We've always been in the business of school improvement. The question is, what are you going to do about it? And so what I want to take you through today is some key ideas. Why raising achievement is important, a reminder of that, because it's not about NCLB and it's not about AYP. Why investing in teachers is the answer, because we don't make that claim often enough, I think. Why formative assessment should be the focus of the investments we make in teachers. But that focus will require very different models of professional development from the ones we've already had, which we call teacher learning communities. And by the end of this keynote, I hope you have some really practical, grounded suggestions about how you can begin to start these teacher learning communities in your schools and districts. Raising achievement matters. It matters for individuals and it matters for society. Skill matters. In the United States, we have a very high premium for skill. If you have a college degree, if you're a male, you will earn 7% more over your lifespan. If you're a female, having a college degree will give you 10% greater earnings. You will actually live longer. Doing that research takes quite a while because you have to wait for people to die before you can estimate the impact of education on longevity. But the latest data we have suggests that an extra year of school adds 1.7 years to life. And you'll also be healthier. For society, it really matters. Hank Levin and his colleagues at Columbia calculated that for every kid who had otherwise dropped out of high school, who we actually help to stay in school, the net benefit to society would be almost $210,000. Most of that would be extra taxes that individual will pay because they'd be earning more money. But an extra $35,000 or so is in reduced healthcare costs, and about $45,000 is in reduced criminal justice costs. Because if we fail children in the education system, they are more likely to be incarcerated, and that is incredibly expensive. Rick Hanyashek at the Hoover Institution at Stanford calculated that if we could raise student achievement by the equivalent of 10 or 15 points, depending how you measure it, on a standardized test, over 30 years, the increased growth in the economy would mean that the extra money in the economy would make the whole of K-12 education free of charge. So put simply, we have to raise achievement. Our future economic prosperity depends on it. America became the world's manufacturer in the second half of the 20th century by investing massively in high schools between 1910 and 1940. In 1944, in England, they had a big debate about whether it was necessary to educate children beyond the age of 11. Because most people's working lives didn't require that kind of knowledge. Now we have pretty much mass high schooling, and the question is, and we're still having the same debate, do all these people need to go to college? Well, in the same way that the investments that America made in the first half of the 20th century led to America becoming the world's leading economy in the second half of the 20th century, America's future prosperity depends on raising levels of achievement even higher. And it's not the schools aren't doing a good job. Schools are doing a better job than they've ever done before, with kids who are more intelligent than they've ever been before. Kids are smarter now than they've ever been. It's called the Flynn effect. Nobody knows why, but basically the kids you're teaching are smarter than you are on average. Teachers in the public schools in the United States are much better than teachers in the private schools. Did you know that? Did you know that? But the international comparisons done by the OECD are called PISA, the Program on International Student Achievement. Kids in private schools actually do better than kids in public schools in the United States. But when you control for the social class of the kids going to private schools, and when you control for the fact that the mix is different, when you actually control those two factors out, the performance is actually better in the public schools in the US than in the private schools, even though the class sizes are often 50% larger. So we have smarter kids, we have better teachers than we've ever had before, doing a better job. Why is it that people are so unhappy? Because the demands of work have grown even faster. 50 years ago, the average working person didn't need to read or to write during the course of a working day. Those jobs don't exist anymore. This chart shows the returns to skill. So, for example, if in the United States you were a high school dropout, in 1973 you could be expected to earn about $13 an hour. By 2005, in terms of real dollars, $2007, your pay has gone down to $11 per hour. This is really quite extraordinary. Think about it. In terms of the massive increase in wealth that's been enjoyed by the United States over the last 30, 35 years, if you are a high school dropout, you are now worse off living in America than you would have been in 1973. Who has enjoyed the benefits? Those with bachelor's degrees, and here, those with professional degrees earning close to $35 an hour. Now, we also need to look at the kinds of skill that are involved. Which of the following categories of skill do you think is disappearing most rapidly from the workforce? Is it the routine manual? Is it the non-routine manual? Are they the routine cognitive skills, complex communication, or expert thinking and problem solving? Without looking at the chart in front of you in your binder, everybody vote now. 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 fingers. Which skill is disappearing most rapidly from the workplace? I could give the people at the back who haven't yet voted a hard time, but okay, thank you. Most of you, like me, thought it would be the routine manual. It's not. The fastest declining skill are routine cognitive skills. These data from 1969 to 1999, the fastest increase has been the demand for complex communication, a 13% increase. Expert thinking has gone up by about 10% in demand. Routine manual has declined, but only by about 2%. Non-routine manual by about 4%, but the fastest decline of all, almost 8%, routine cognitive. What are the routine cognitive skills? 20 years ago, if you wanted a mortgage, you went along to a savings and loan or a bank and you asked nicely, and a human being made the decision about whether you got a mortgage or not. Today, it's an algorithm based on your credit score. So a whole lot of those kinds of middle skill jobs, the cognitive skills, the jobs that we're really good at training people for, are disappearing fastest of all. Routine manual jobs will decline, but not as fast as the non-routine manual, and not as fast as the routine cognitive. There are certain kinds of jobs that can't be outsourced. Hairdressing. No one is going to send their hair to Bangalore to be restyled, no matter how inexpensive it is. Well, actually, I just did, but that's a different story. And similarly, the availability of taxi drivers in Shanghai is irrelevant when you're actually waiting here in Las Vegas for a taxi to go to the airport. So there'll be certain kinds of skills that will always be in demand, but what the previous chart I showed you shows is that the rewards to those kinds of skills will decline. So we'll see a hollowing out of the marketplace. So we need to make schools more effective. And the problem is that for the last 20 or 30 years, we've been looking in the wrong place for solutions. Now, the United States is still stuck in what I call the first generation of school effectiveness research. You look at the raw results. Some schools get good results, some schools get bad results. Conclusion, schools make a difference. If you believe these data, then it suggests what you need to do is to make more of your schools like the schools that are getting the good results. Yeah? So it's very simple. What you have to do, you have to do three things. One, get rid of the boys. All over the world now, girls are outperforming boys. The more girls you have in your school, the better you're going to look. Second, become a parochial school. And thirdly, and most importantly, move your school into a nice, leafy, suburban area where the parents have got lots of money to pay for private tuition. Nothing will make your school look as good as having the parents shelling out for private tutors. Now, as most people point out, those are not real solutions because that approach to measuring school effectiveness does not take into account the fact that different schools serve different communities. And what you find when you begin to partial out those effects, when you use what are called demographic-based approaches, you find that schools don't make much of a difference. Over 90% of the difference between schools is nothing to do with a school. It's just to do with the kids that go there. And so there's been this long-standing belief that schools cannot make a difference. Schools cannot compensate for society. But very recently, as we began to look at what kids know when they start at the school, what kids know at the end, and begin to look at how much progress kids make, we found some very interesting findings. Schools don't make a difference, but classrooms do. It turns out how much you learn in 4 or 5 years at a school doesn't really matter according to which school you go to, but it matters very much which classrooms you're in that school. This chart shows the data from the OECD, and here's the USA's data. This horizontal line separates out the differences between schools below the line and the differences within the schools above the line. So actually, as you can see, most of the difference between schools, most of the difference in the US is between schools. Sorry, it's not between schools, it's within the school. So it's actually the differences between kids that are making the difference. But when you look at the stuff that, even the stuff that is between schools, the so-called school effect, this black bar here is explained by the social background of the schools. This dark grey bar here is the proportion explained by the social background of the students, and this tiny little bit here is the only bit that is the school effect. So it turns out it doesn't matter which school you go to, you'll make the same amount of progress, but the question is which teachers you get. The variability at the classroom level is up to 4 times that at the school level. In the US, it's probably 10 times. And it's not class size, I'll say more about that in a minute. It's not the between-class grouping strategy. It's not how students are grouped between classes through tracking or within the class. It's the quality of the teacher. And this is a really important message that we've actually suppressed for many years. Teachers unions and politicians have conspired together to commodify teaching. We treated teachers as being a commodity. We need more teachers, we'll just give them emergency permits and just ship them in. And it turns out that it's the only thing that really matters. The quality of the teacher you've got is the crucial difference. So we have a classic labor force issue. We could replace existing teachers with better ones, a bit like Reagan tried with the air traffic controllers in the 80s, fire them all and start again with less troublesome ones. The trouble is that there isn't any evidence that paying more would bring in better teachers, and the alternate route data, teachers coming in with alternative forms of certification are no better than the ones we got. So, if we're serious about raising student achievement, we have to invest in the teachers we've already got. My colleague Marnie Thompson calls it the love the one you're with strategy. I've taken a long time to get to this point. Most people just assert this. Teachers should get PD. What I'm saying is the future economic prosperity of the United States depends on making the teachers we've got better. This is not an optional extra. Professional development is not a nice perk so that we can give teachers 5 extra days of hanging around with their mates, rather than having kids with them. The only thing we can do to make this country continue its 200-year drive towards increased economic prosperity is by making teachers better than they are right now. And there's the teachers we've already got. Every single teacher needs to get better. Not because they're not good enough, but because they can be better. Our role model should be Tiger Woods. In 1999, Tiger Woods won the US Masters by a record 12 strokes and immediately decided to change his swing. Best golfer on the planet, and he decides he's not good enough. For every single teacher we have in this country, we need to get over the message that they need to get better. Why? Because they're not good enough? No, because they can be better. Every teacher's constant experience is failure. We teach these brilliant lessons, and we take in the kids' notebooks to look at what they've written, and we realize that they appear to be inhabiting a different planet from the one that we were on. You show me a teacher who says they're not failing every day, I will show you a teacher with low expectations of her students. Our constant experiences of failure, the great thing about teaching, what makes it such a wonderful job, is that you never get any good at it. And that's a wonderful position to be in. Andre Previn was at one time the highest paid film score composer in Hollywood. And one day he walked in and quit. And somebody said to him, "Why do you quit this amazing job?" And he said, "I wasn't scared anymore." He wanted a job that provided constant challenge with no formula that you can copy. He just wanted to be forced to renew and invigorate himself every day. Well, congratulations, you've got that job right now. And it's the hardest job I know. I've taught 8th grade math, and I have run a university. And teaching 8th grade math is harder. It's more cognitively demanding. I know this because how my performance is affected by the fact that I have a slight cold. Running a university with a slight cold is not a problem. Teaching 8th grade math when you're not 100% perfect on top of your game is a disaster. So we have to create a culture in which every teacher expects to get better all the time. And that's liberating, not depressing. The trouble is that we haven't got very many good models of doing that at scale. We have research. I just came from AERA in San Diego, the American Educational Research Association. There you have people talking about 5 years' work they've done with 30 teachers. Well, we've got 2-3 million teachers in the US. So the question is, what can we do that will work at scale? And that's what we've been working on. First thing to do is to start with a cost-effect comparison. Imagine you go into Sears and you want to buy a refrigerator, and the guy says to you, well, there's 2 models, that one's $1,000, that one's $500. What's the first question you ask? What am I getting extra for the $1,000? I say, nothing at all, they're exactly the same, but you can choose to pay $500 or $1,000. Pretty dumb, huh? And yet that's what we do all the time in educational policymaking. We do things that are going to be incredibly expensive with very small benefits. Class size reduction. If we reduce class size by 30%, so if you can So in every district, we reduce class size from 30 down to 20 students. It's going to cost one, two. Yeah, I'm back on. I'll keep those back in. So what I want to make clear is I'm not saying that class size reduction doesn't work. Unlike this microphone. I'm not saying that class size reduction doesn't work. It does. You will get higher achievement with kids in smaller classes. But the effects are small, and they're incredibly expensive, $30,000 per classroom per year. Oh, and by the way, you're going to have to build an extra 1 million classrooms. And that's an upper bound. You'll get that in kindergarten, first grade maybe, probably not second, and certainly not in the higher grades. Why is the effect so small? Because of the importance of teacher quality. When you reduce class size, you need more teachers. That's what they discovered in California. When you reduce class size, you need more teachers. And the teachers you bring in will not be as good as the ones you've already got. If class size doesn't, if teacher quality doesn't matter, then that's not a problem. You can just get on and bring in extra teachers who are as good as the ones you've already got. But the research is showing that teacher quality is the most significant variable. So what you do when you reduce class size is automatically to dilute teacher quality, which is why the effects are quite small. Content knowledge. Everybody worries about content knowledge, and certainly, in some schools, particularly in elementary schools, content knowledge really is a problem. There's a lot of teachers teaching math who don't know much about it. But what's surprising is how little difference it makes. So Deborah Ball's work with fourth grade math teachers found that if you could increase their content knowledge from well below average to well above average, you would get an extra 1.5 months learning per year in your class. And there's a question mark in the cost column because nobody's figured out a way to do that yet. So I'm not saying that content knowledge doesn't matter. What I'm saying is that it makes less of a difference to kids' outcomes than people assume. What we do know is that when teachers rigorously practice formative assessment, or assessment for learning, as Rick Stiggins calls it, we get something like 6 to 9 months extra learning per year at a cost of around $3,000 per classroom per year. So in our search for a way of improving education at scale, we have latched onto formative assessment, not because we like it, not because we have shares in companies that sell this stuff, it's because the cost-benefit analysis drives us to say, of all the things we could be doing to make a difference, this one appears to be the one that gives us the greatest payoff. If you want to know the research, those studies there, between them, synthesize the results of about 4,000 research studies. And they all find consistent, substantial effects. Doesn't matter whether you're talking about first grade or college studies, doesn't matter whether you're talking about math or music, doesn't matter whether you're talking about the United States or Portugal, you get the same sorts of size. An increase of 60, 70, 80% in the rate of student learning. Okay, so what I'd like you to know, just to give you a chance to absorb something, this is not a slide you've got in your pack, so just take 1 or 2 minutes to respond to this log. So I'd like you to respond to 1, 2, or 3 of these prompts. So far I have learned, one thing that surprised me was, the most useful thing I've learned so far is, one thing I'm not sure about is, I want to find out more about is, and to bring you back, rather than shouting over you, what I'll do is when I want you to come back all together again, I will raise my hand like this, and I'd like you to do 2 things. Yeah? One easy, one hard. The easy one is to raise your hand, and the hard one is to stop talking. Okay? So 2 minutes just to filter what you've been doing so far. Thank you. Do you know what my favorite TV program is right now? The Dog Whisperer. I think all teachers should watch The Dog Whisperer, because what I see there is a guy who's actually exerting what he calls this calm, assertive energy. And if only teachers could learn to do that with their students, I think our classrooms would be a lot more successful. I see these teachers shouting at their children in the same way that you see these people not controlling their dogs. And so for me, this idea of actually getting a class back together after a discussion by just raising your hand and looking like you're calm and in charge, rather than trying to shout over kids, just seemed to be very, very effective. Okay, let's find out what people thought. Okay. I'm not going to get all the way to the back this time, I don't think, but people generally at the back think that they can actually get away without participating in these kinds of events. But I'll start with you. Okay, so what was your immediate reaction?
My immediate reaction.
Sorry.
That's right.
Try now.
My immediate reaction.
It's not on.
I'll just speak real loud.
Yeah.
My immediate reaction was really about the impact of students and the teachers,
Okay.
and how powerful the classroom was with the teachers.
So the power of the classroom for the fact that teachers make a difference.
Huge.
Absolutely. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. And what about you? What was your reaction?
I think the biggest thing for me is that idea that we can all get better. I don't know, you always end up with those pods that you think, oh, like,
Right.
get rid of them. It's really that feeling, that frustration, and it's like, no, we need to focus on what we've got and everybody getting better.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. Sorry, did you want to say something?
Yes.
Okay.
What I wanted to say was that I always knew that I needed to learn more, and what I learned today was that no matter how long I teach, no matter how much I know, no matter how much I try to better myself, there's always room for growth.
Yeah. So there's always room for growth, and that's great. Some people think that's negative. It's great. But the point I want to make now is what I've been trying to do here is to show you how you can create a kind of participation without a kind of participation at random. It's not normal, is it, for people to pick on people in the audience without their consent? You know, our standard script is, does anybody have anything to say at this moment? No? Fine. I mean, how did it feel when you realized I might pick on you at random? Didn't it feel strange? He's broken the first rule of professional development, which is I can go to sleep if I want to. So one of the things we're finding is that this is what Cassie referred to this morning as pedagogies of engagement and pedagogies of contingency. This notion that by actually requiring people to engage, and I'm going to say more about that later on, but by requiring people to engage, you can actually begin to change the way that the classroom functions. And it's very hard to do because it's so counterintuitive. Okay, so what do we mean by formative assessment? The problem is that Black and William 98, as Jeff referred to, was a kind of a bit of a landmark study. So what we have reluctantly concluded is to make sense of what's going on, we have to look at the different cycles of formative assessment. And there are long cycles, there are medium cycles, and there are short cycles. So the long cycle stuff, you can buy tests from a whole range of providers. They'll test your kids every 6 to 10 weeks. And you can use those tests to predict which kids in your district are going to fail the state test next March. It won't tell you what to do about it, but at least your impending failure will come with plenty of advance warning, and you can begin to polish the resume. These kinds of things do work when you have very poor classroom alignment. So when I was working in Trenton with the Central High School district there, we found that in New Jersey, kids have to take an 11th grade test, and if they fail, they can't get the high school diploma. So it's quite important for the kids, except it's not, because then you can make it up in a whole range of ways, which creates a lot of work for teachers, but that's a different story. But anyway, this test was meant to be reasonably high stakes. What we found was that the math teachers in Trenton Central High School weren't teaching the things that were on the test. They hadn't even thought about alignment. So sometimes these long cycle formative assessments can help you secure better instructional alignment. Just make sure you're teaching what you should be teaching. And so it can show you that the teachers in your schools are not actually covering this topic as well as they should be, and so you can get a quick win. Might be important politically to actually begin to experience some success, but the effect, so it's a one-time deal. The medium cycle stuff is the kind of stuff that Rick Stiggins emphasizes. Here, the span is within and between teaching units. The idea is getting the students more involved, so you have student engaged, but fundamentally it's still about what leads to the grade. So in a way, it's more about summative than about formative. What we've found is the stuff that makes the biggest impact on student outcomes is not the week by week or the month by month stuff, it's the minute by minute and day by day stuff. That's the stuff that makes the biggest difference. So yes, what these people who sell tests that you can use to align your curriculum, it probably is fair to call it formative, but it's a mistake to assume it's going to give you a big impact on your children's test scores unless you have very bad curriculum alignment. It might be okay, you might need that quick win, but once you've sorted out those basic problems, it's going to do nothing more for you. The only way of improving your kids' outcomes is to improve the teaching quality, and the estimates that we have is that somewhere between 30 and 40% of teacher quality is how teachers teach. It's pedagogy, not curriculum. Pedagogy trumps curriculum. A great curriculum badly taught is always a worse experience than a bad curriculum well taught. And the other reason that we think is an important starting point is that in most districts, people have very little control of the curriculum. So it's not a smart place to start this discussion. How teachers teach appears to be a very much more tractable way of doing it. So this short cycle within and between lessons, what we call day by day and minute by minute, what you find is that two things are changed. One is you get increased student engagement, and the second is you get improved classroom practice. Teachers' classroom practice becomes more responsive to the students' needs. So as Cassie said this morning, there are three key processes here: where learners are in their learning, where they're going, and working out how to get there. And looking separately at the role of teachers, peers, and learners, we end up with this rather complicated grid. So there are 9 cells, which we're going to reduce to 5 key strategies. The first thing is clarifying and sharing learning intentions. One of the big reasons that kids fail in school is they don't know what it is they're meant to be doing. I go into a math class and I say to the kids, "What are you doing?" And a kid will say to me, "Page 37. I ask kids, "What makes a good story?" And some kids will say, "Well, it has to have an attention-grabbing first sentence. It has to have lots of powerful verbs and descriptive adjectives." And other kids will say, "It's got to be neat and long." Sadly, middle-class kids tend to answer in the former way. A lot of working-class kids answer in the latter way. A lot of the reason that working-class kids do badly in our schools is they don't know what it is they're meant to be doing in school. So clarifying the learning intentions seems to equalize the playing field. Engineering effective discussions, tasks, and activities that elicit evidence of learning. Obviously, that includes questioning, but that's not just questioning. If you're working with very severely and profoundly disabled students, maybe touch is the way that you're eliciting evidence. But it's whatever the teacher does to find out where kids are in their learning. Providing feedback that moves learners forward. Cassie this morning emphasized the importance of giving comments rather than grades, but even comments might not be helpful. Too often, when we write comments on kids' work, it's telling them what was wrong about the piece of work they just turned in, not what they can use in the next piece of work to do better. Doug Reeves describes that as the difference between a medical and a post-mortem. The trouble is, most of our kids get post-mortems. They don't get feedback that's useful. The most powerful processes, of course, are these last two. This idea of activating students as owners of their own learning and activating students as learning resources for one another. So it's not just peer assessment and self-assessment, it's also this notion of getting kids to take ownership of their own learning. Each of these 5 strategies brings in a lot of other things. These last 2 bring in collaborative learning, reciprocal teaching, and peer assessment. And perhaps most of all, I think, activating students as owners of their own learning. Metacognition, motivation, interest, attribution, and self-assessment. I was working with a teacher in Scotland a few months ago, and in her classroom, she has a poster that says, "Stuck? Question mark? Good. It was worth coming in today." That really hit me, because that's not the message we send in most of our classrooms, is it? I will try this in your district. Ask your teachers who is their best student. I guarantee they will choose the highest achieving student. Now, if we were serious about learning quality, wouldn't they pick the person who is most resilient in the face of failure? Who is the best support to other students in the classroom? Who knows that learning can be painful and involves taking risks? Because after all, the word student is the same as studier. Who is your best studier? And yet we send this message that the good kids get everything right. And when I ask an audience of this kind for a question about what some research found out, you know what? When I tell them what the correct answer is, there's always at least a dozen people in the audience who go, yes, because they got it correct. They are pleased because they already knew something I was just telling them. Now, isn't that odd? So I just apologize to them. I say, I'm sorry, you obviously knew what I've been talking about for the last 10 minutes. So the last 10 minutes have been a complete waste of time for you, and I apologize. See, the only point of being in a classroom is to be stuck and confused and wrong, and to have the emotional resilience to work through that and actually to become better. So activating students as owners of their own learning and activating students as resources for one another becomes actually the most important part of effective formative assessment. Okay, so how do we do this? Well, explaining learning intentions at the start of a lesson or unit is very popular. Giving the learning intentions to kids in the student's own language, and you get great discussions when you get kids to discuss the scoring rubric. Get the kids to construct their own scoring rubric. Posters with keywords to talk about learning, providing planning or writing frames. Annotated examples. So before you give kids, say you're teaching 8th grade science, before you get kids to do a lab report, you take 4 lab reports from last year's class, remove the names, and then get kids to look at them and say, what's good about the good ones? Which ones are better? Why are they better? What's good about the good ones? What's missing about the ones that are less good? And what you find is that just spending some time exemplifying success like that, looking at failure. You know, we know that kids are much better at spotting errors in other people's work than they are in their own. So just making that a formal part of teaching. And finally, giving students opportunities to design their own tests. A study done in 1994 divided a large group of students into 4 batches. A quarter of the students were given a study guide. A quarter of the students were given practice tests like the one they were going to be taking. A quarter of the students were given free rein to prepare for this test as they preferred. And the last group was asked to construct test items on what they had been learning. But they had to be test items with a correct answer key. The kids had been divided into random in these 4 groups. When they actually gave the real test, which group came out on top? The kids who'd been writing test items. And if you have 2 parallel classes, like a period 1 class and a period 2 class, what you can do is make the period 1 class write the test for the period 2 class and vice versa. And if you issue the kids with pseudonyms, you can even get them to grade each other's tests. Much less work for the teacher and a really high quality of learning, even if all you care about is test outcomes. How do we elicit evidence of student achievement? Well, the really important, the key factor here is that questioning should cause thinking. Or provide data that teachers can use to adjust their instruction. So the first strategy here is generating questions with colleagues, and I'm going to talk a bit more about that in the workshop. Japanese teachers hardly ever take in kids' books. notebooks to grade. Why? Because they check that the kids have learned something through having a high-focus question before the kids have left. Think about it. Grading kids' work is a matter of putting their learning back on track, one kid at a time, after they've gone away. Duh. Wouldn't it be better to do it with the whole class in one go by having a really smart question before they leave? So it's about planning your teaching better to include these questions so that you don't let the kids leave before you've checked up on their learning. Closed versus open. I don't know what it is about education schools in the US, but every teacher seems to emerge with this idea that closed questions are bad and that open questions are good. I really don't understand it at all. What colour is the sky? What colour is the sky? Blue? 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 It depends on the day. Choose a day, choose a colour.
Time of day. Red sky in the morning.
Red? Grey? Blue? Blue? So was that an open or a closed question? Why is it closed? One answer. How do you know? How do you know there's only one answer? I haven't evaluated any of those answers yet. No? So? See, the thing is, whether that question is closed or open is not in the question. It's in what the kids or you think I'm looking for in the answer. I can walk into some classrooms and every single kid will say blue. Blue, 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 blue. I can walk into other classrooms and kids will be vying with each other to come up with exotic colour names like cerise and turquoise and aquamarine because they know that's what the teacher values. So the question is not closed or open in itself, it's what's in the classroom contract between student and teacher. It's that network of expectations that every teacher builds up with their kids. But a much more important distinction is not between closed and open, it's between high order and low order. So can you have an isosceles triangle with two right angles? Now you see, that's a pretty closed question, isn't it? Because there's two answers, and one of them is wrong. But it's useful because it gets kids to think. And there's lots of different approaches. Some kids will do it through the angle sum. You get some really interesting questions like, can you have an angle of 0 degrees? I know they've got to add up to 180. I've got two 90s here, but the third one could be 0. You see other kids trying to build really long, tall, thin triangles. It's a powerful question, not because it's open, because it isn't. It's very closed. It's a powerful question because it causes thinking. So the important thing is high order versus low order. So I'm going to pick on some other people now. Okay, what's 3 threes? 9. Okay, that's one answer. Any different answers? 33. How's it 33? 3 and 33, okay. Any different answers? A flower. That's a 4th grade answer. She's heard me before. Yeah, a flower? You see? Now what happens is your brain, some of the 4th grade answers, 83. Do you get 83? A small flock of birds. Basically, the research on creativity shows that at 4 years old, when you give people these creativity tests, they score about 90%. By the time they're your age, below 20%. But the important point is that when you thought I was interested in a question of factual recall, you were engaged in what psychologists call reproductive thinking. You're going to your memory banks and trawling out a fact. And the really important thing is that that causes no new learning. It makes the recall of that fact in the future slightly quicker, but it doesn't cause any new learning. When you realize I was interested in something else, then your brain switches gear into what's called productive thinking. And it's productive thinking that causes learning. So the important thing is you have to give kids high-order questions. And the depressing thing is that most teachers typically their questioning is 90% low order. I will just enact a little script for you because I know you've seen it before. Right, class? Remember yesterday we talked about how plants made food? We had a big word for it. It began with P. Anybody remember what it is? Yes. And the teacher is in a hole because they have to get somebody else to provide the missing word. It's like an extended close procedure. You know, the teacher leaves gaps in the conversation that kids have to provide in order to make some attempt at participation. And kids are just playing a game of guess what's in teacher's head. I'm at the back of this classroom and I'm thinking, I have no idea what she wants. So the important thing is that we actually get teachers to ask questions that cause kids to think, and if they do, that they give kids appropriate wait time. Now this is really interesting. Every teacher I know knows the research on wait time. They just don't do it in their own classroom. That shows that the problem is not a lack of knowledge, it's a lack of understanding of what it means to do it in your own practice. That's why models of professional development that involve telling teachers new stuff are a waste of time most of the time, because that's not the problem. The problem is supporting teachers to change what they already do. One of our teachers that we work with was so enthused about this research, the very next day he tried out giving kids more wait time. And he asked these much more carefully phrased questions, and he gave a lot of gap at the end, waited for the students to reply and didn't interrupt the students while they replied. And a student came up to him at the end of the lesson and said, "Sir, you were really slow today." Because there's this teacher been playing serial ping pong with this kid, just batting things backwards and forwards, and all of a sudden he's like the old $6 Million Man movie, you know, so it's slow-mo. So we've got to get away from this IRE, this initiation, response, evaluation. That's what researchers call what they see in classrooms. Teacher says something, initiation, student responds, response, teacher evaluates, IRE. I call it serial table tennis. What we need is more basketball. So I ask you a question, I'll ask you what you think of his answer, and I'll pick on you for an explanation. One teacher, she calls it pose, pause, pounce, bounce. Pose the question, pause, pounce on one student, and bounce that student's response to another student. And you can actually see her doing it. Pose, pause, and she actually got this little thing she says under her breath. 1, 2, 3, 4, got to wait a little more. Because she knows that's the only way she can slow herself down. No hands up except to ask a question. If you're not doing that, if you're not emphasizing that in your own classroom, your results are going to be worse than they would be otherwise. The most natural script in the world. I get depressed by this. When I do a talk and they have a holding slide to show I'm an educationist, what do they show? They show a board, an adult at the front, and kids with their hands raised like this. And that looks like a good classroom because all the kids have raised their hands. It's completely maladaptive. Why? Because the research on intelligence shows that, yes, environment causes intelligence, but intelligence causes environment. What they find is the Head Start works while the kids are in Head Start, but if they go back to the environments they were in before, all the gains they make in terms of IQ go back, are lost. If they learn to read in Head Start, they keep that, but the gains in cognitive power are lost because they're not being challenged. Bruce Biddle reckoned that low-quality schooling will cost a kid 6 IQ points a year. In England, we have found that a kid who is at the top 10% of cognitive development at age 22 months, coming from a working-class family, will be overtaken by a middle-class kid in the bottom 10% of cognitive development at 22 months by the age of 7. So one of the slowest kids at 22 months in a middle-class household will overtake one of the smartest kids from a working-class household. And it's because those kids aren't getting the stimulation. So let's think about the traditional classroom. The teacher is trying to engage the class, and you've got 6 or 7 students who are dislocating their shoulder sockets, trying to show that they're ready to answer. And you've got 24 other kids trying to stay below the radar. What's going on here is those kids who are engaging are actually getting smarter. The work of Neil Mercer at the Open University in England shows that by getting kids to argue about science concepts, you can increase their scores on purely spatial IQ tests. IQ is not fixed. The more you think, the smarter you get. And so what you have in the traditional classroom is some kids who are engaging in everything the teacher is throwing out, and they're getting smarter. And you've got other kids trying to stay below the radar, trying to avoid getting called on to participate. Those kids are actually foregoing the opportunity to get smarter. So if you are allowing kids to choose whether to participate in your classroom, you are making the achievement gap worse. It's as simple as that. And that's why we say that the standard rule should be no hands up. If the teacher asks a question, then the teacher should choose who to answer. And the other thing is the teacher has to use a randomization device. Teachers say to us, oh yeah, I'm going to call on kids at random. But you know, they don't, because teachers are spookily drawn to the students who they know will give them a correct answer so they can get on and finish the lesson. So what we've done is to encourage teachers to use a randomization device, and one of the most popular is kids' names written on popsicle sticks. And you put in a cup, and you pull the names out at random. And you see, again, teachers say, oh yeah, well I pull the name first and then I ask the question. No, because that means then you dumb down the question if you think it's a slow kid. So you have to ask the question first and then choose the stick. And this has enormous possibilities for teacher play. So one teacher I know, whenever a kid is messing about, acting up, she writes his name on 10 additional popsicle sticks and adds them in there. One teacher has what he calls the can within a can. So he can put the stick back for somewhere where he can actually find it again for easy retrieval. I've seen one kid's name come up 4 times in the same 45-minute lesson, and he just thought he was having a really unlucky day. Now, the other thing that happens is often, even when the kid's name comes out at random, the kid will say, I don't know, because they can't be bothered to think. They're just blowing you off. And what happens in some teachers' classrooms is the teacher says, okay. Now let's analyze what happened there. The teacher says, I want this to be a classroom where everyone thinks. Kid says, I don't want to think. Teacher says, okay. The kid has just won. The smarter response is to say, okay, if you don't know, I'm going to get some other answers, and then I'm going to come back to you. And you go around the class and get some other answers and come back to the kid and say, now, which of those answers do you like best? So that kid knows that they're not going to get away without thinking. The other thing that sometimes when you know the kid is just blowing you off because they can't be bothered to think about it, what I've seen work very effectively is the kid says, I don't know. The teacher says, yes, but if you did know, what would you say? And it's amazing how many times the kid actually realizes they're not going to get away with it, and they actually then have to start answering. Now, this is very scary. So, because it changes all the rules, there's nowhere to hide in the classroom. So what some teachers make it into a game. Every kid is given 1 pass card per week with their name on it. It's got to have their name on it, because otherwise you find kids scalping these 2 other kids. And when the kid's name comes out on the popsicle stick, the teacher says, do you want to play or pass? And if they want to pass, they have to use up their pass card. Other teachers allow kids to phone a friend, ask the audience, or if it's a multiple choice question, go 50-50. You can make it fun without compromising this fundamental importance, which is pedagogies of engagement. If kids are not thinking in the classroom, they're wasting their time there, and they're wasting yours. Hot seat questioning is where you actually pick on one student and ask a second and a third and a fourth question to really get into a topic, rather than scattering out questions about, as most teachers do. Most teachers say you can't do that because they've got a task over there. Not if I say summarize what he just said. So there's other ways of keeping kids awake. Now, all these are very good techniques for creating engagement, but unfortunately, they're not very good ways of helping teachers make smarter instructional decisions. The instructional decision that I made most often in my days as an urban teacher was, do I need to go over this one more time? Or can I go on? How did I get an answer to that question? I would make up a question on the spur of the moment. I would ask the class the question, 6 kids would raise their hands. I'd choose one of them. He or she would give me a correct answer, and I would say, good. Off we go. How dumb is that? I'm assuming that the other 29 already knew it or are now okay because they heard one kid utter the correct answer. So if we're serious about not just pedagogies of engagement, but also pedagogies of contingency, so that we're actually making smarter decisions to adjust our teaching to better meet our students' learning needs, then we need to use what we call all student response systems. And I used one with you, where I asked you to vote 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 on that trends in labor supply. If you prepare the questions ahead of time, it's very easy to do. You can do it with cards, where you just get 4 cards to a sheet of letter paper, run off on a card. It's great using these. So some teachers were so worried about kids cheating and copying, the rule was that when you had to vote, you had to do it secretly below your desk, and then you had to put your head on your desk and hold it up like this. And within 2 weeks, the kids didn't care. The kids didn't mind getting things wrong because the teacher had created this as a classroom where if you had a misconception about something, and that word misconception proved to be very powerful to the students. So a lot of teachers don't like the word, but the kids said, I used to have a misconception about this, or I had a misconception about this particular topic. There's other nice things you can do, like, for example, guesswork will get you the right answer 1 time in 5 with the standard multiple choice question, but if you have 2 correct answers, guessing is much less likely to be successful. Mini whiteboards. I think mini whiteboards are brilliant. I think mini whiteboards are the most important development in educational technology since the slate. None of this is new. Elementary, you're teaching phonics. You say to the kids, give me a 3-letter word with a short O sound. Every kid holds up the answer. Every kid gets it right. You move on. Nobody gets it right, like Cassie said this morning, teach it again, but slower and louder. But the most likely outcome is that you get a difference of response. And then that leads you into a really productive whole class discussion. And what we found with these letters in particular is if you get kids to leave the letter they thought was the correct answer, it needn't be one where there's only one correct answer. You're collecting views, and then you say, now you thought the answer was A. Why was that? You also thought the answer was A. Was that for the same reason or for a different reason? And what we find is that teachers become smarter in their management of whole class discussions because they can bring in different kids at the right time. So this is really about using information to adjust your instruction to better meet your student learning needs by calling on kids at the right time in the conversation. Now, you thought the answer was B. What do you think of somebody who says the answer is A? Are they just different or are they wrong? And so you can actually keep on modifying the whole idea. One teacher, she only uses 4 responses on our multiple choice questions, and if every answer has at least 3 kids choosing it, she sends them to the 4 corners of her classroom because she's got them labeled A, B, C, and D. And so you can see the kids in the C corner. Their task is to work out a way of convincing all the other kids that C was the best answer. And you see this little boy in the C corner listening to his friends, and you can see an expression of puzzlement begins to cross his face. And he's beginning to think that C might not have been such a smart choice after all. So you see him beginning to sidle towards the D corner. And he's sidling because he thinks he's cheating. I think he's learning. And so what you can see is all the time, this is another example of using information to adjust your teaching to better meet your students' learning needs. Now these kinds of questions, I mean, the mini whiteboard, you can use that in 1st grade, you can use it in 12th grade. AP Calculus, sketch me a graph of y equals 1 over 1 plus x squared. Everybody hold them up now. Quick eyeball, you can tell straight away. Teaching them atomic mass and atomic number. Take a sodium nucleus, add a proton, take away a neutron. What have you got? Kids will actually signal to you very quickly if they get what the whole thing is about. So the idea of really getting into this, and we've been working with teachers in Pennsylvania and New Jersey now, and they tell us that if they go a whole 40-minute period without getting information from every single kid about something, they begin to feel jittery. They realize that if they're not getting evidence about whether the kids really get this, And of course, some teachers just get the kids to vote. Everybody okay with that? Thumbs up, thumbs down? And of course, the kids who want a quiet time just say, yeah, fine, go on. So it has to be something that's cognitive, that's a deep assessment of the fundamental principles of this. Let me give you an example in math. Give them two sets of numbers, 2, 4, 6, 8, 0, 2, 4, 6, 8. Which of these is the correct answer? A, the two sets have the same mean. B, the two sets have a different mean. C, it depends whether you choose to count the 0. C is the most common response. Kids think that you can choose whether to count the 0 when you're calculating the mean of a set of 5 numbers. They're wrong. You have to include the 0. You don't get to choose. But those kinds of questions can really probe deep understanding rather than just skimming across the surface. And finally, the exit passes question. Here, the idea is that where you want a slightly longer response than you could get on a dry erase board, the idea is that you get kids to write the answer to an exit pass as they leave the classroom. So it's a 3x5 index card, and you say to the kids, for example, 7th grade history, why are historians concerned with bias when analyzing historical sources? And you take these answers in as the kids leave the classroom. It's their exit ticket. What do you do with it? You don't grade it. You read through these answers, and then you put them in the trash because you know where to start tomorrow's instruction. You're using information about student achievement to adjust your instruction to better meet their learning needs. It doesn't need to be recorded. It just needs to make your teaching smarter. Feedback that moves learning on. The really important thing about feedback is that it should cause thinking. It should cause a cognitive engagement. Comment-only grading, sure. Focus grading. How many of you believe that your kids spend as long taking on board the feedback you provide them as it takes you to provide it? Okay, that's got to change. We give kids far too much feedback, and we don't give them enough time to do anything with it. And in fact, most of the feedback we give kids, no engineer would recognize as feedback. Feedback is a term that educationalists borrowed from engineers. The classic feedback system is the thermostat, the room thermostat. In your room, you have a thermostat which includes a temperature measuring device, a thermometer, a setting for the desired temperature, a device for comparing these two things, and then 2 wires that lead to the furnace or the air conditioner. But to an engineer, it's only a feedback system if the information being fed into the system is used to change the setting of the system. Now, if I say to a kid, C-, must try harder, that is not feedback in the sense that any engineer would recognize. Because there's nothing in C-, must do better to help the kid know what to do. Most of the feedback we give is a bit like telling a young softball pitcher that her ERA is 10 and she better get it down. Yeah? And that is what she needs to do, isn't it? So it's accurate, but it's not particularly helpful. It's useless, in fact. She knows she needs to improve. You might look at her pitching and you say to her, yeah, it's your rising fastball. It's not rising. Those of you who know nothing about soft pitch postball, the idea of a rising fastball is it's thrown with so much backspin that as it reaches the plate, it rises sharply, and it's quite unhittable. The trouble is, if it doesn't rise, it's a fastball over the middle of the plate, which is very easy to hit. And so you say to this young athlete, I've got it, I know what it is, it's your rising fastball, it's not rising. And she said, thanks, I knew that. But if you can see something in her mechanics that makes you realize that what she's doing is not dropping her pitching shoulder sufficiently to deliver the pitch from below the knee, which is actually quite an important part of the mechanics for that particular pitch, then you're giving her something to work with. That's feedback that moves learning forward. And what we need to do is to make the feedback we give kids in academic subjects exactly the same. It's not feedback just for the sake of feedback, it's feedback that moves learning forward. Focus grading. I used to train teachers, and I used to think I was pretty good at it, but I was actually pretty bad at it. Because whenever a teacher was struggling, I used to say, well, just do what I do. And then that didn't work, so I then started giving them feedback. So I would sit in the back of their classrooms and I would write details of every single thing they'd done wrong. And in a 45-minute lesson, I could generate 3 pages of mistakes they had made. And I would bestow this wonderful gift of feedback. Just put this right, you'll be great. And I was having no impact at all. And I realized the problem was I was giving too much feedback. So what I started doing was saying to them, but the next time I come and see you teach in 2 weeks' time, I want you to work on this and this. And I gave less feedback, and I had more impact on their development. Focus grading. Be selective in what you find. Explicit reference to rubrics. It's amazing how many teachers give kids scoring rubrics, but in the feedback they give, they never actually tie it back to the rubric. And then suggestions on how to improve. Yes, strategy cards can be used, but they're not particularly useful. Perhaps the most useful one is not giving complete solutions. The math teacher said to us, look, this comment-only grading works fine for language arts, but it doesn't work in math because if I check 15 as correct and put a cross next to 5 others, the kids can work out for themselves they got 15 out of 20, even if I don't tell them that. So we said to them, why don't you just tell the kids that 5 of them are wrong and they have to find them and fix them? Make sure that feedback causes more work for your students than it does for you. And the language arts teachers pick that up. In a final draft of a piece of writing, a dot in the margin means there's something wrong that needs attention. For the weaker student, you can differentiate that. P if it's a punctuation error, S if it's a spelling error, G if it's grammar. But the whole idea is that feedback should cause more work for the student than it does for the teacher. And then retiming the assessment. Why do we have an end-of-unit test? It's too late. Why not have a 2/3 or 3/4 of the way through a unit test? That's what Japanese teachers do. They actually give kids a quiz 3 lessons before the end of the unit. And then they don't grade the quiz, they just look at the quiz, answers, and decide what to do in the last 2 lessons to cover the things that the kids are having most difficulty with. Students as owners of their own learning. Students assessing their own or peers' work. One of the things we find most powerful here is this protocol we call 2 stars and a wish. The idea here is that when a kid gives a feedback to another kid, they say, I like that, I wish you'd done that. So 2 stars and a wish. Or if you want to be even softer about it, you could say 2 stars, I like that, even better if, and then a suggestion for that. And we found that also giving kids post-it notes to write the comments on other people's work is very helpful, because then if the recipient doesn't like the feedback they're given, they can just discard it. Training students to pose questions. When a teacher finishes a topic, typically what they say is, right, anybody got any questions? No? Right? Good? Off we go. And nobody puts their hand up. So what we now encourage teachers to do is say, in your groups, decide if you've got any questions. And if you do, write them on these strips of paper and turn them into me. The teacher can then deal with these questions in a more systematic order, and the kids get better at asking questions. And then finally, self-assessment. Traffic lights have been used quite a lot. The idea that kids at the end of a piece of work give themselves a self-assessment related to the learning objective. Green, got it. Yellow, not so sure what's going on. Red, no idea what's going on here at all. Typically, we find that boys would give themselves a green, where a girl would give herself a yellow, until the teacher said, red's over here with me. Greens help the yellows. Yellows make sure the greens understand this stuff quite as well as they think they do. Another teacher said, why wait until the end of the lesson? So she actually gave every kid a disc, green on one side, red on the other. This is AP Calculus. This is the same teacher who uses popsicle sticks to choose kids at random. It's really interesting. A lot of teachers will use popsicle sticks with elementary school kids, maybe the early grades in middle school. They won't use it in high school because it's babyish. Actually, it's really important, because when you pick on an 18-year-old at random, the first thing that goes through their mind is, why are you picking on me? Well, when you've used the popsicle sticks, the answer is, it's your unlucky day. Deal with it. Now, what's the answer to my question? Anyway, this AP Calculus teacher gave every kid a disc, and the lesson starts with a green disc uppermost, and If you think the teacher's going a bit fast, you just turn it over to red. And so she was teaching this lesson, and this girl sitting at the back, she turned the disc over to red, and she realized the teacher hadn't seen it. The teacher sitting at the front with the overhead projector transparency, just going blithely on deriving formulae. This girl looks at her two friends, realizes they haven't got a clue what's going on again, so she grabs their discs as well and starts flagging the teacher to slow down. And when we heard that story, we thought, what an amazing kid. But afterwards, time and time again, we've heard these stories. When you open up those channels of communication with kids, they will use them. When you get to kids involved in their own learning, when you get them involved in reflecting, those kids show you that they understand far more about their learning than you usually assume that they do. One teacher teaches kindergarten that we've been working with. She gets the kids to do a self-portrait once a month, September, October, November, December. In January, the kids have to get out their self-portraits, and they have to comment on what's got better about their self-portraits over the 4 months. And this little girl said, "My arms don't come out of my head anymore." It's a kindergarten. The teacher gets the kids to sign in. Monday, Tuesday, the kid's name is written down the side by the teacher. Columns for signing in. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Of course, these kids can barely write their own names, but they do a sign in. On Friday, they have to go along with a buddy and agree which of these 5 sign-ins is the best. They're constantly finding ways of getting kids involved in commenting on the quality of their own work, reflecting on the quality of their neighbor's work. Now, the research on feedback shows that you've got to get the kids' ego out of the classroom. But it's also important to get the teacher's ego out of the classroom. Have you ever had one of those lessons where you know it's not working, but you can't stop yourself? You're at the bottom of a very deep hole and still digging. Well, one of the teachers we were working with is teaching 8th grade science. And it was one of those days in the summer, it's hot, the class is going to sleep, the teacher's getting more and more in kids' faces just to try and wake them up, and it's not working. And all of a sudden, a kid puts his hand up and says, "Sir, this isn't working, is it?" And after the lesson, the teacher told me, a year ago, I would have been so angry with that kid for showing me up, embarrassing me. But, he said, I've been trying to get the kids to take more responsibility for their own learning. And so the teacher said, "You're right, what should we do?" And not one kid suggested going out and having a recess. They had a sensible conversation about their learning, about what could be done. So kids, if you open up the conversation, will actually help you teach better. Another teacher tried these discs, and she found she couldn't see them in her classroom because of the glare from the fluorescent light. So she went down the party store and gave every kid 3 cups. Beginning of the lesson, green cup showing. If you think the teacher's going a bit fast, and you want it to slow down, you show yellow. If you want to stop and ask a question, you show red. Why would anyone show red? Because the rule in this classroom is as soon as one kid shows red, the teacher picks at random from all the other students in the classroom by using the popsicle sticks, and that selected kid has to come to the front of the classroom and answer the question being posed by the kid who showed red. She has turned her classroom into one gigantic game of chicken. And you know what? She's now had, after 2 weeks, she had to introduce a different rule. No one can stop the lesson more than once every hour. Because the kids were stopping the lesson all the time. Now, kids who are so into their learning that they're saying to you, I don't get it, slow down, are going to cause us problems. But they are problems we should want to have. Kids who are so connected to their learning will give us difficulties, but those are exactly the kind of difficulties that make us into better teachers. So, that slide appears twice. So we call this keeping learning on track. The whole idea is that you keep learning on track, and I'm going to skip this next learning log because I'm going to need to finish by talking about how we put it into practice. The problem is teachers know most of this already, so why aren't they doing it? As I said earlier, it's because the problem is not the teachers don't know this stuff, it's they don't get chances to practice it. So telling teachers doesn't work because they know it already. But we also know that experience alone is not enough. If that were true, then the best teachers would be the most experienced. And that's not true. What we need to do is to create situations in which teachers get support for practicing these techniques and getting the support of colleagues in order to improve them themselves. And there's two problems with this particular kind of stuff. The first is that teacher learning takes time. Every teacher started out as a student. Every one of us in this classroom learned most of what we know about teaching before our 18th birthday. Those scripts about what teachers do in classrooms are hardwired into us before we even get into education school. So the idea of raising your hand to answer a question seems like the most natural thing in the world. It's not natural, it's hardwired into us by our classroom experiences. The second thing is, these practices are unpopular. They go against the grain. Parents think that giving kids grades makes better learning. They are wrong. The more you grade kids, the less learning you'll get. That's been demonstrated amply, but people don't believe it. So these practices are hard to change in themselves, and they're unpopular. They go against the grain. So we need to develop teachers in a way that's gradual and slow. The model that we're suggesting involves both content and process, hence the title of the chapter in Ahead of the Curve. I don't believe that professional learning communities are a good idea in themselves. They're good for some things and not other things. First decide what you want teachers to change, and then decide what's the best way to change them. The evidence is that increasing the use of formative assessment is probably the most effective way to improve student outcomes. And the stuff that really matters is the short cycle, minute by minute and day by day stuff, so you have to change teachers' practice. It's as simple as that. The evidence I've shown you already, says that this is the right thing to be doing. The techniques I've talked about give teachers a starting point, but then we need to add 5 things in terms of our process. Every teacher needs a choice. It's a mistake in general to make teachers work on their weaknesses. There are some teachers whose weaknesses are so egregious that they need to be fixed before anything else. But by and large, kids are helped more when teachers work on their strengths than on their weaknesses, because they can become really exemplary in a particular way. So you have to give teachers choice. Flexibility. Teachers need to adapt these techniques to make them work in their own classrooms, as the teacher who went down to the party store and converted that to that. Another example, a teacher who got into comment-only grading but was still not impressed with the amount of time the kids were taking reading the comments. This is a 10th grade English language arts teacher. What does she do? She writes the kids' feedback on strips of paper rather than the essay itself. And then what does she do? She gives each group of 4 kids back their 4 essays and the 4 strips of paper separately, and the kids have to work out which comment goes with which essay. Isn't that smart? I just saw that last month. Isn't that amazing? So teachers, the creativity of teachers is unlimited. And what we find all the time, teachers making these incredibly smart modifications because they're given flexibility. Small steps. You need to allow teachers to go as slowly as they like. I think every teacher has to accept the professional commitment to change. If you don't think you need to get better, you need to leave the profession right now. Everybody needs to get better because you can. But what we find is if you force teachers to go faster than they want to go, they will humor you while you are around, and as soon as your back is turned, they go back to what they were doing before. So you'll end up with less change if you force teachers faster than they want to go, and you have to make them accountable for having a professional development plan, but you must also provide them with support for doing that. How do we suggest we do that? We think the idea of teacher learning communities is a good idea. Some of you I can see are old enough to remember a program called The Paper Chase with the crusty old law professor. What's interesting is you go to any law school in America, you'll be taught the same way. They don't mess about with the method because it's good enough. Teachers want novelty for every single PD event, and it gets in the way of teacher learning. Imagine a medical student saying, what are we doing tomorrow? Rounds, ward rounds. Oh, can't we do something different? We did ward rounds today. No, we're going to do ward rounds tomorrow and the day after that and the day after that, because ward rounds is how you learn medicine. And in the same way, we think the idea of having a signature pedagogy, a protocol that for teacher meetings, which actually has the same structure every single time, turns out not to be boring because the structure fades into the background and the learning comes into the foreground. If you're always changing the structure, people are focusing on learning the new structures rather than the learning that they're meant to promote. So there's a whole long list of what teacher learning communities we think can help you do. Those are pretty obvious. Here's what we've learned. This is the design science. We don't know this is the right answer. Here's what we've learned, what we think is right. Plan that will run for 2 years. Optimal size, 8 to 10 teachers. Obviously, if you're in a rural district, that'll be hard. With similar kinds of assignments, monthly meetings are optimal. Minimum length of meeting, 75 minutes, 90 minutes, even 120 if possible, and time between the meetings for teachers to watch each other teaching. So this is all we need, I think, to revolutionize our teaching force. One 75-minute meeting once a month, and an hour a month for teachers to watch each other teach. We advocate a signature pedagogy, the same structure for every meeting. Begin with introduction and housekeeping, then how's it going? Every teacher tells the group about how they delivered on the commitment they made at the previous meeting. Nobody can tell them what to do because it's their plan. They're getting the support of the group, so it's re-professionalize the individual. Here's what I'm trying to work on. Here is what I tried. Here's how it went. Give me some help here. To keep the meetings fresh, new learning about AFL every 20 minutes or so, and then most important, personal action planning. Every teacher plans what they're going to do between this meeting's end and the beginning of the next meeting in a month's time. They write it down on a strip of paper, which is then collected by the group leader so that they are clear what they're doing, and a quick summary of the learning. Every group has to have a leader. There's a long list of things here, but the only one that really matters is this last one. Not to be the AFL expert. Our experience is that when there's an AFL expert in the room, they end up telling other people what to do. Every teacher is where they are, and what they need is help in moving forward from where they are, not somebody else presenting some vision of how perfect they are as a practitioner. And that also ties in with some of the stuff that Cassie was talking this morning. And then finally, peer observation. The really important thing is to distance this from performance management or inspection by the principal. So here's the rules that we've learned make a big difference. One, when you're coming in to see me teach, I tell you what to look for. I'm working on questioning. I tell you what evidence to collect. I'm interested in my wait time. Here's a stopwatch. Count my wait time with a stopwatch. And even more important, any notes that you make in my lesson belong to me. And by being really strict about those three things, we found much less problems with unions in terms of focusing this on the professional development agenda rather than a management and accountability agenda. So we've got currently projects going in these districts with some promising, not conclusive data on student achievement. The evidence is that teachers are enjoying it, teachers are finding this rejuvenating. We got 20 and 30-year veterans saying, I wish I'd come across this stuff 20 years ago. So it really is delivering three things. One is increased teacher participation, teachers enjoy it, kids more engaged, and the preliminary evidence is we're also getting higher student achievement, for example, in Cleveland, which is about the most dysfunctional school district we've worked in. Their tax base collapsed so much that every teacher with less than 8 years seniority was fired. So you had kindergarten teachers teaching 8th grade just because they were left. And even there, it's made a difference. So to summarize, I've argued that raising achievement is important. I've argued that raising achievement requires improving teacher quality, and the only way to improve teacher quality is by investing in professional development. But to get that investment right, what we have to do is to make sure that that investment is focused on the things that make a difference to kids. You can change teachers in a whole range of ways. Some will make a difference to kids, some will not. You have to be disciplined about focusing those things that make a difference. Don't let teachers choose, because they'll do things that don't benefit kids. To be effective, we have to focus on both on what teachers need to change, but also to accept how teachers change. Teachers get through the day by having habits. When you learn to drive, the idea of changing gear and turning on the turn indicator and steering round a corner just seemed impossibly complicated. And consciously, they were. You can now do it all because you have habits. You've habituated those behaviors. Teachers are the same. They get through the days with habits. Unfortunately, some of those habits are not as good as they could be. So teacher learning is very slow because it's just like trying to avoid slipping the clutch as a driver. It's a very hard habit to break because it's so ingrained into your practice. So we think the combination of a focus on assessment for learning, or formative assessment, supported with teacher learning communities, gives us a point of uniquely high leverage, which is not the only important thing, but it allows us a focus into the things that really do matter. I'll close with a quote from a book called Return to Love by a woman called Marianne Williamson. Our greatest fear is not that we are powerless. Our greatest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. The research on teaching shows that that is true for teaching. Teachers are the most important influence. Teachers trump school background, home background, linguistic background, special needs, everything. If we can make the teachers we've got better than they are right now, then we can actually transform our education system. Thank you very much.